Hello everyone and welcome, and let's get right into the video. I know it's been a while since you guys have seen me, but we've got a lot of ground to cover today. So, quick disclaimer, American Protestant evangelicalism and/or fundamentalism in particular has a fixation with the Bible and, quote, only the Bible as the absolute center of Christianity. If you're a Christian who's never been an American Protestant evangelical, this probably sounds like silly sauce. Obviously, the Christian faith has never centered exclusively around the text of the Bible. That's ridiculous. That's idolatry. To which I can only say, yeah, exactly. That's what I've been trying to tell my parents for the last 2 years. A lot of the ideas I'm going to be discussing in this video are set against the backdrop of American Protestant evangelicalism in specific, not against the backdrop of Christianity as a whole. So, for those of my Christian viewers who are not and never have been American Protestant evangelical and/or fundamental, if you'd like a glimpse into the dark mental chasm from which the hapless evangelical is eventually forced to climb, stick around because you are in for a treat. Also, I'm already tired of saying American Protestant evangelical. How's APEV sound? Let's make a deal. APEV, our new noun and adjective. So much easier to say. So for today, as per the title, we're going to be working with Pete Enns' 2014 book, The Bible Tells Me So, a book that's been hugely influential in my life personally. Technically, it's my second theological step to the left, but I'd like to discuss this book first because I think it fits better with the direction this channel has been taking so far. Now, there are already some great reviews of this book online and on YouTube, so I'm not going to be reviewing this book exactly, but I am going to be discussing a lot of its big ideas in some detail. The thesis of The Bible Tells Me So is that a faith that hinges on defending a flawless, timeless rulebook Bible is a faith that necessarily produces anxiety, because actually reading the Bible opens us up to the fact that it isn't set up to handle those kinds of expectations. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Chapter 1. I'll take door number 3. The Bible is quite possibly the worst thing to ever happen to American Protestant evangelical and fundamental Christianity. See, when APEV say things about the Bible like, it's inerrant, it's timeless, it's truth directly from God, it's absolutely right and true in every regard, and then we get to actually reading the Bible, like, oh my god, what is this? It contradicts itself. It has stories where snakes talk and the sun stops. It has God literally ordered people to kill all that breathes in some cases. How are we supposed to deal? But then, is this a problem primarily with the Bible or with us? Is there something wrong, perhaps, with the assumption that a book from God can't behave like this? Is it possible that a messy Bible like the one we've got is actually a Bible that God wanted us to have, as is? As a son of German immigrants, author Peter Enns grew up a very casual Lutheran until his teens, when he went to one of those church services with that evangelical altar call, you could die and go to hell tonight, so make sure you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. He went on to a small private evangelical college, graduated, married, and then had an encounter with an atheist friend that left him feeling deeply underinformed about his own Christian framework. Eventually, he wandered into seminary and from there to Harvard Divinity School for a PhD in Near Eastern languages and civilizations. Now here's the thing about seminaries with fundamentalist or evangelical Protestant roots. They tend to warn you primarily against not even secular and pagan culture, but primarily against non-conservative, and in a lot of cases mainstream, Bible scholars who are liberal and not faithful to the Bible. Because of course, these are the people who are the most dangerous in the widespread conspiracy to undermine the Bible. Yeah, so obviously when Enns got to Harvard, he found that there was no conspiracy. That was not the case. But it was the case that in seminary and grad school, the final breaking point came for Enns as an APEV. I'll discuss the details perhaps in another video, but the point is that at this point in the story, Enns found himself facing one of 3 choices, or as he saw it, 3 doors were facing him. Door number 1, pretend he'd totally never seen that problematic thing that he'd seen that's totally risking his evangelical faith, and go through life not thinking too hard, not reading the Bible too closely except for the parts that your pastor or small group leader assigns. Door 2, actively fight back, prove how perfect the Bible actually is, become an apologetic maybe, all that jazz. Or Door number 3, take the challenge, reevaluate religiosity, and follow the truth wherever it leads. And once you've chosen door 3, like Enns did, like I did, there's not really a chance of going back. And it's very risky, psychologically, personally, professionally, because again, if you've got an evangelical job, you will totally get fired and ousted if you speak up about the holes in evangelicalism. But what you also discover when you choose door 3 is that you are not by any means alone. That so many people, Christian people, faithful Christians, have been noticing exactly the same kinds of problems you have for a while and have said and done a lot of the same things you have. We also get a roadmap for the rest of the book. Number 1, we're going to be looking at divinely approved and divinely mandated violence throughout the Bible. Number 2, the scientific and historical inaccuracies in the Bible. Number 3, the fact that biblical authors are always saying different things about stuff. Number 4, the New Testament writers using their scriptures in ways that horrify evangelicals, but is actually very Jewish. And number 5, the idea that the Jesus thing was a big surprise. And also a little bit about the end, about how best to handle a Bible that does the things that it does. Well, I hope you're ready. Chapter 2. God did what? So remember the thing about the violence toward Canaanites that I mentioned in that other video? I wish I could say that that's the only time that God just orders or quietly countenances this kind of stuff, but then there's like the flood that kills everything and everyone on the entire earth, or like God asking explicitly for a child sacrifice, and like the time that he got pissed enough at his own people, the Israelites, to want to kill them all. Oh, that's just Old Testament stuff. You say, okay, well, let's go to the New Testament where there's the cross, for crying out loud, or that time that a couple got struck down dead for not giving all their land to the Christian commune, or lying about it, the text isn't clear. Or how about Paul saying in 1 Corinthians that Christians who have gotten sick and died brought it on themselves because they did a religious meal incorrectly? Okay, you get it. Violence in the Bible is a thing. Now, our author, Enns, has chosen to use the Canaanite problem as a lens through which to talk about the issue, probably because American Protestant evangelicalism has a history with this passage. APEBs, and really Christians of all stripes throughout the ages, have been coming up with all kinds of lines to get around this problem. Like, oh, well, God's ways are infinitely mysterious and he's perfect and he knows better, so shut up, human. Which is pretty terrifying and horrifying because, like, do we really believe in a God whose infinite mysterious ways include ethnocentric violence? I hope not. Or, like, God is forgiving and nice in other places in Scripture, which is true, but it's not relevant to the Canaanite issue because God is never accepting and forgiving toward the Canaanites. Or my personal favorite, the Canaanites were super bad and wicked and degenerate and they deserved it. Which is exactly what imperial and colonial powers say about the people they brutalize all the time, and it's also not true relative to our main characters, the Israelites. There are more lines, but you get the point. They don't satisfyingly settle the ethical problem. And now we get to one of the lines in the book that I know made APEB readers everywhere crazy. God never told the Israelites to kill the Canaanites. The Israelites believed that God told them to kill the Canaanites. For non-Christian readers, I guess watchers at this point, no, this is not a cheap excuse to get God off the hook. For Christian watchers, this is not an attack on the truth of the Bible. It is a big paradigm shift, an invitation to look at the Bible as the ancient literature that it is. Let's, to drop another line from the book, step outside of the Bible and into the world of the Bible. See, here's where going behind the text is instructive. To cut a very long explanation short, the world of the ancient Near East is a world deeply steeped in a kind of monolatrous polytheistic nationalism. Monolatry is different from monotheism because monolatry is a worldview that assumes, like polytheism, that many gods exist, but that only one is worthy of, quote, our worship. To put an ancient Near Eastern nationalist spin on this, the God that a monolatrous nation, like say Israel, considers the most worthy of worship will just so happen to be the one that favors their own nation. Which also means that conflict or contact with a foreign people is directly conflated with conflict or contact with foreign gods. Oh, and another complicating factor. Remember when I said in that authorial intent video that the best archaeological evidence that we have indicates that the wholesale genocide described in Joshua didn't actually happen? Well, here's where that's relevant. I don't have time to get into all the reasons that scholars say so, but I will say this much. There is evidence, not of a sweeping invasion from an outside force, but of inter-town skirmishes in the land called Canaan. The people that became the nation of Israel probably came together gradually in Canaan relatively quietly from a group of different peoples. So, what's with all the genocide stuff in Joshua? Well, it's possible that it's a later exaggeration of the early conflicts, centuries later probably, and it would be very much in keeping with other similar exaggerations of probably historical stuff. And now we get to a quote that has been really helpful in changing my view of the Bible. God lets his children tell the story. Because at this point you may be wondering, well, if God never told the Israelites to actually kill the Canaanites, and if that never even happened, then why would they say that it did? Well, it's possible that, as one of many ancient religiously nationalistic peoples, this is just the language with which people talk about God, like he's a tribal warrior king. So why does God let the Israelites talk about him like this if he's not? You might ask. Well, here's an analogy. As a young schoolboy, Pete Enns used to talk about his dad as an engineer who left a glowing academic career behind in the old country and came to America after World War II, in which he was a war hero. Now, if you'd been an adult at the time and you knew the family well, you'd have known that the facts, well, were a little different. The elder Enns was not an engineer, but a machinist. His young son didn't know the difference. He barely finished the equivalent of high school. He got drafted into World War II, where he served as a translator, which made a lot of his work classified, and was a Mennonite-raised pacifist. Does this make his young son Peter a liar? No, it makes him a young boy who was proud of his father and talked about his father's life and work with the limited information that he had, and he unconsciously shaped it according to the cultural rules of schoolboy talk. I mean, if you want to call that lying, I guess you're not strictly wrong, but I'd argue that you are demonstrating a big lack of empathy with school children and have probably forgotten what it was like to be one. When Enns, the younger, says that God lets his children tell the story, this is the kind of thing he has in mind. In telling the story of a God who commanded them to slay their enemies and invade their land and take it for their own, the Israelites are telling the story of the God that they know with the finite religious language that they have, using cultural language that's available to them as ancient Near Eastern people, which suggests that this vision of God isn't really the full story of who God actually is. But it does make it a part of Israel's story. And speaking of which, Chapter 3, God likes stories. Enns opens our section with a comparison of two movies, the 2013 film 42 and the PBS documentary Baseball, both of which relay some version of the story of Jackie Robinson as a prominent black player in a deeply racist American sport. I won't get into the details, but the larger point is that each of these pieces of media are on some level factually based, but neither of them relays to facts, as it were. Both of them are stories. People who tell stories are human. They never know absolutely every single detail if they're telling something that is based in real events. They tell stories from different angles. Their aims in telling their stories differ. Audiences differ. Storytellers who are talking about their past are always shaping their narratives to help them make their point. They make decisions as to what details are more and less important to emphasize. They fill in gaps, because every story has gaps. They add dialogue, etc. Biblical authors no exception to this, so when they do history, maybe we shouldn't look to them to objectively relay facts, because that's not what they're interested in doing. Like, okay, Jesus, the most important person in Christianity. Aren't there like 4 different versions of his story? Each of the Gospels, while based around what does seem to be the same person, come from different writers at different times with different priorities for different audiences. Like, for example, the birth narratives. The Gospels of Mark and John don't have birth narratives at all, and the birth narrative in Matthew differs from the birth narrative in Luke in incompatible ways. The Christmas story that you're probably familiar with if you live in America is a mishmash of things from Matthew and Luke. Oh, and then the Easter story. What happens after the risen Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene? What's that? All the Gospels say different things? And then events in Jesus' life are presented in different orders, and each Gospel has at least one story that the others don't. Now, if our theology hinges on our Bible getting historical stuff right, this is a huge problem, because, whose Gospel is the most truthful? Are they all lies? But if we're willing to make the paradigm shift to seeing the Gospels as purposely constructed narratives, each with some kind of historical memory behind them, we might come up with the idea that the past serves the present. Now, as good modern post-Enlightenment Westerners, we like to pretend that our interest in the past is neutral, that real history is a pursuit free of agendas or biases, especially political ones. But ancient historians and biblical writers were more honest in that respect. They made no bones about the fact that they were telling stories of their pasts with the goal of addressing questions or problems in their present. Now stop me if you know this already, but the Bible's relationship to history is a big talking point in contemporary America. On the one hand, we have the new atheist types who are all like, hey, Bible is big lie, Christianity debunked. And on the other hand, there are all the apevs who are like, no, actually this stuff is true and factual, you just have to squint hard enough. And both of these positions operate on the same base assumption, that the Bible is only valid as God's word if all the factual history and all the science check out, which doesn't actually respect the Bible on its own terms as an ancient book. I know it might seem ironic, but insisting that the Bible has to be accurate to be valid is trying to force it to be something that it's not, and rejecting it when it's not accurate is rejecting it for something that it's not, which, I hope that's not a philosophy that you take into your personal relationships. Chapter 4. Why doesn't God make up his mind? Ends opens with a few cute anecdotes about just how unscripted the process of parenting actually is. He's a father of 3 himself. Parenting just doesn't come with instructions, and trying to do things by the book for its own sake doesn't typically work. And no, the Bible does not work as a parenting manual either. Actually, the Bible doesn't work as a manual for anything, as we've been demonstrating, and nowhere is that more clear than in the fact that the Bible doesn't always say the same stuff. So, there's the book of Proverbs, which apevs really like, because on the surface, it looks like a collection of, things that clearly tell you what to do, which immediately makes chapter 6, verses 4 and 5 a little bit of a side-eye because, well, okay, I'll just read them out to you. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. Which of these is correct? Well, obviously that's context dependent, which means it's a judgment call, a wisdom call, which might be why they call Proverbs wisdom literature. Do you get up in the comments of that YouTuber to correct that foolishness? Do you get up in that public figure's Twitter mentions, or do you save your energy and your mental health by blocking that idiot and moving on with your day? That's a judgment call. By the way, while we're on the subject of Proverbs, let me clear up something small. In the Old Testament generally, and in Proverbs specifically, a fool is not someone who doesn't have a high IQ, isn't quick on logical processing, doesn't test well, etc. A fool is someone who is morally deficient, who knows right, and chooses not to act on it because they don't want to do right. When the author of Proverbs is talking about a fool, that is not an ableist judgment, that is a moral judgment. Okay, now let's get to some real, actual, substantial disagreement. Proverbs generally, verses 4 and 5 of chapter 26 aside, would lead you to believe generally that doing the right, wise thing will lead to God's pleasure and your good fortune. Ecclesiastes, on the other hand, well, Kohelet, the guy quoted in text as the source of Ecclesiastes' teachings, is quite possibly the most pessimistic person in the Bible. Kohelet is done with the wisdom thing. Death sucks. Injustice rules. He's not convinced there's an afterlife. Pretty much all of life is meaningless. Okay, cheerful dude. But then there's Job. Now, the deal with Job is that Job, the man, the character, has literally done all the right stuff. He's very pious, and according to the theology of some parts of the Old Testament, he has been accordingly blessed with wealth and 10 children, because that's how the theology works. You do what you're supposed to do, God blesses you with wealth and prosperity and stuff. So one day, God just allows some heavenly member of his staff, as it were, to go pick on Job, basically as part of a bet, not because Job's done anything wrong. So all in one day, Job loses all of his wealth, all 10 of his children, and to top it all off, is covered in painful sores, text says, from head to foot. Understandably, Job curses the day he was born and is reeling, trying to comprehend what's going on. Enter Job's 3 friends. To their credit, they do seem to be doing the very best thing they know to do. They mourn with Job for a week in silence like you're supposed to do. Then begins a series of very long poetic speeches. Job is a book of poetry as much as it is anything else, where the 3 friends are like, "But Job, you must have done something to deserve all of this misfortune, just repent." And Job is like, "I haven't done anything wrong. I am not going to repent. I have no idea why God is doing this to me." Now, I think maybe we're a little too quick to get judgy with Job's friends. Letter A, victim blaming people for their own misfortune is something we do all the time. Letter B, Job's friends don't have the information we do, that Job really didn't do anything wrong, and that God really is just using Job to prove a point to some member of his staff. Now, Job's friends are going by the book. They're sticking to the theology that the author wants you to assume that they know. That doing things right brings God's blessing, and doing wrong things brings God's punishment. And at the end of the book, God shows up, finally, and he explains nothing. What he does have is a rebuke for Job's friends. Apparently, what they've said is wrong, while what Job says is right. I'm not usually a big fan for finding the moral of biblical stories, but if the book of Job has one, Ends would argue, and I would agree, that it's don't assume that you know what God is up to, or why, just because you have the book. Switching gears, while there are parts of the Old Testament that do assume real monotheism, that is, one God exists, more often than not it seems to assume monolatry, like I said, acknowledging the existence of multiple gods, but only choosing to prioritize one. I will say that the New Testament, which is significantly later and has significantly more Hellenistic influence, does pretty uniformly assume monotheism, but the point is, you'd think that the Bible would at least be of one mind about how many gods exist, but it's not. And oh yeah, what is God like? Well, if you believe, like, the flood story and, like, the story of Genesis 18 and, like, the story of Exodus 32 and others, he's just, like, a regular guy who gets mad and has to be talked off the ledge and can be bargained with and doesn't know things and has regrets about decisions that he makes. And how about the law that Christians talk so much about? Law codes say different things about the same situation. Like, okay, can you keep other Hebrews as slaves? When you keep other Hebrews as slaves, do you keep the women under the same circumstances as you keep the men? Where do you do your holy sacrifices? How do you do the Passover meal? All of it depends on which law code you're reading. Do you get it? Trying to follow the rules of the Bible is a doomed endeavor from day one, and it doesn't seem to be something that God has a lot of patience for. Instead of looking at the Bible as a manual, and to just looking at it in large part as a story, the ever-evolving story of ancient Israel that we are literally watching as it unfolds. Now, we've spent a lot of time pretty exclusively in the Old Testament, so let's see how the first Jesus followers added to that constant reinvention paper trail. Chapter 5. Jesus is bigger than the Bible. How's that for fighting words? Anyway, so in addition to being an ancient Near Eastern languages and civilizations scholar, Peter Enns is also a college Bible professor. Now, if you've ever had to study the Bible in an academic setting, like I have, you know that the Bible is not an easy book to get into. One thing that Bible professors will not let you get away with is making a random passage of the Bible say a thing that you wanted to say just because you have a point to prove. But the problem is that in the Gospels, Jesus does literally this. Like, okay, there's a passage in Luke where he's debating some Sadducees who apparently don't believe in a final resurrection, and who are presenting to Jesus a hypothetical problem of marriage complications at the resurrection. And Jesus is like, well, that's not a problem. There won't be marriages and stuff because they'll be like angels. In case that made too much sense, he then goes and pulls this quote from Exodus. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and concludes that God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Which doesn't at all take into account the original context of that Exodus quote and what God is saying and doing, but like in the logic of the story, it's like resurrection undebunked, guys. So yeah, if you're like me, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But Jesus is not like me, thank God, and neither is his audience. Jesus just doesn't interpret the Bible in ways that we're used to. The word that Enns uses is creativity. We're watching Jesus interpret his Bible creatively. Now, we might see this kind of creativity as disrespectful, but for Jesus and the people who would have listened to him, this would have been the very height of reverence. See, at this point in Jewish history, debating Torah and other scriptures and coming up with creative readings was just part of what it meant to be faithful and Jewish. In order to be faithful to the Bible, they had to interpret it creatively, in part because the world that they lived in was just different from the world that their texts came from. The kinds of things that they debated were how to do their creative interpretations effectively, not whether or not to interpret creatively. So the problem that Jesus' contemporaries would have had with him was not the fact that he pulled a random passage from Exodus to prove a point. It would have been the fact that he made that point about himself. In text, he's always interpreting his Bible to make a claim to divinity and messiahship, two different things, and he's making the text all about himself. He's like picking fights with other Pharisees constantly, like some bullheaded teenager. Like, who is this man? And let's not forget, those of us who are Christians say we affirm that Jesus is also human, like a man, a first-century Jewish Pharisee of his time and place, who did things with his Bible in ways that other people of his time did. Some Christians, and I don't think it's just APEVs either, are more comfortable with a Jesus who was completely unique at every moment, who never fit in culturally and socially, and who was always distant from, real humans, stuff like this. And yet that very union, that meeting of divinity and humanity that we call the Incarnation, is at the core of our Christian faith. And Enns argues, and so do I, that denying stuff like Jesus' Jewish interpretive methods is low-key denying the Incarnation, and we don't get to do that. Chapter 6. No one saw this coming. Alexander Graham Bell is credited with the invention of the telephone. If we could somehow bring him back to life in the present, could we explain to him the iPhone? I mean, maybe, because iPhones do have communication qualities, but they're also vastly different enough that Bell's conceptual world of circuits and wiring would have to be very adapted to explain concepts like, apps and cloud storage. While the Jesus story is deeply rooted in the story of Israel, he's also a big surprise in some really key ways. So when the gospel writers and the authors of the epistles are getting ready to make their case that Jesus is the guy, they end up having to read and interpret their Bibles to articulate their story in new and unexpected ways. Again, I do not have time to get into all of it, but resurrection and various kinds of Messiah were already ideas that existed inside of Judaism. If you're interested, you can see these ideas developing in the Apocrypha and some of the literature from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other stuff. But here's the thing with Jesus. The idea of one Jew resurrected now as a Messiah that was executed on Roman orders, all that stuff is new, and new stuff is a hard sell. And as if that wasn't bad enough, these crazy authors then proceed to throw in the idea that because of this executed, resurrected Messiah, Gentiles are now welcome to be part of God's chosen? Again, I hope the point is obvious, that the New Testament authors were adapting and transforming the biblical story, interpreting creatively. For example, at the end of the Gospel of Luke, a newly risen Jesus just boom appears to his disciples out of nowhere and proceeds to tell them that, gang, all that's happened over the past few days, crucifixion and stuff, is in fulfillment of the scriptures. Just read them. They say that I had to suffer and die and rise on the third day. And of course, nowhere in the Old Testament does it say that line. So why does Luke have Jesus say that something is in the Old Testament that isn't? Unless maybe what Jesus is asking his disciples to do is to not find the Old Testament verse that says that thing, but instead to reread and reimagine Israel's story as a whole in light of his life and death and resurrection. Because the whole reimagining the existing story in light of new circumstances is kinda on brand for the rest of the Bible, as I hope we've seen. Oh, and then there's the way that the gospel authors reimagine the Babylonian exile. I'll talk more about this in another video too, but the exile of the Judahites to Babylon in 586 BCE is the central trauma of the Old Testament. And by the 1st century CE, the nation of Israel had never had full independence and sovereignty since the exile, except for the 100 years after the Maccabean revolt. Remember how I said that various kinds of Messiah were already floating around in Jewish literature? Well, in some cases, the idea of Messiah was somebody who was going to finally restore Israel's sovereignty, and who was going to bring a final, real end to the exile. And then along comes Luke, along comes Matthew, and they insist on folding the story of Israel into the story of Jesus. They insist that the exile is not something that ends with the restoration of Israel's sovereignty, but somehow in the life and resurrection of the person of Jesus. And then there's Paul. I debated leaving this section completely out of the video, I really did. The script is already getting long, and Paul is kind of the most polarizing figure of the New Testament. But I think I would be doing a disservice both to Enns and to Paul if I left the Paul bit out. So again, I'll talk more about this in another video, but Paul is in a pretty difficult position. He's an educated Hellenized Jew, he's a Jesus follower, and he seems absolutely convinced of two things. Number one, that Jesus is the endgame of Israel's story, and B, that because of Jesus, somehow, Gentiles have just as much access to God as Jews do, as Gentiles. Both of these convictions seem to be driving pretty much everything he's trying to do persuasively in his writings. So when he's trying to write about how following or breaking Torah doesn't relate to being part of God's chosen, and when he's pulling Old Testament allusions and references, in our view, entirely out of context, he is being very Jewish in his interpretive methods, but his conclusions are unique. He's interpreting the past, Israel's story, with a view towards serving his present goals and aims, just like the Old Testament authors were doing. Being faithful to the Bible is not accomplished by sticking to the words that are on the page. The Bible itself models for us constant reinvention in light of changing needs and circumstances. And if we are Christian, it is Jesus who is supposed to be the center of our reflection, not an idealized version of the Bible that doesn't exist. And Jesus is bigger than the Bible. Chapter 7. The Bible Just As It Is. There's an absolutely lovely little section that encapsulates the essence of the book in a much more compact manner than this video. Then we move on for a moment to ponder just how absolutely incomprehensible our universe is. I mean, just the parts that we can observe. How can we, if we are Christian, think that the Bible is literally all there is to say about a God who we believe is responsible for a universe like the one in which we live? And then we get what I think are some pieces of great advice. Not rules, good advice. The Bible that we've got is the Bible that God gave to us, as is, with all its problems. The Bible is not, never has been, and never will be the end game of Christianity. That's Jesus. If the Bible is a weapon, it is not a weapon that you get to use on other people. It is the weapon that works on you, not to bludgeon you, but to challenge you and transform you. If your faith, assuming that after reading the Bible you still even have one, is unsettled and uncertain, that means you are maturing. Don't be afraid of being wrong about stuff, unless, being wrong means like hurting people. Realize that you will get stuff wrong, because that's what being human means. Branch out, learn stuff, become religiously literate, appreciate wisdom from other traditions, including other Christian traditions. Take a page from Judaism's book, by which I mean embrace dialogue as truth and debate as worship. And finally, don't, if you're a Christian, expect less humanity from the Bible than you do from Jesus. For are we not incarnational? Wow, this took a lot longer than I expected it to, and the script turned out to be a lot longer than I thought it would be, so congratulations for making it through. As I said, this was a book that was hugely influential for me as I was starting to make my big shift. I wanted to pull out the big ideas for you guys because in future, when I say things like God lets his children tell the story and the Bible works as a model, I want y'all to know where they came from. As always, thanks for watching. I don't know when exactly this video is going up. Hopefully it'll be before the walkout, which I am taking part in, so I will not upload during that period. I'm also going to be at home for Christmas break after December 14th, so while a video might go up during that time, I will not be recording scripts because I can't really do that at home. I am going overseas to study abroad in January though, so I do hope to get some recording and uploading done during my term there. I will be online though, regardless, and my now open Discord is linked in my description. You are all invited. I would like to thank Carl, my patron, and I invite you to consider supporting me on Patreon if you would also like your name read aloud in the end credits. Have a nice day, everyone!